What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture, it's a place of history, it's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution.
For the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg for me is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, virtual edition. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Billy, Alicia, and Sebastian for ASL translation and live captioning tonight's event for the hearing impaired. We'll paste instructions for viewing captions in the chat window now. My name is Brian Jones. I'm the director of the Center for Educators in Schools at the New York Public Library and formerly Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. I'm thrilled to be back filling in for your usual co-host, Robyn Spencer. The Schomburg Center is a world-renowned institution dedicated to preserving and interpreting the global Black experience. This season, the Schomburg Center continues to explore radical imagination, creativity, and liberation through its many dynamic programs and exhibitions. Don't miss this month's free poetry celebrations and musical concerts. 2 dates to save. June 9th, the Center for Educators in Schools is offering a full day of Juneteenth-inspired professional learning for educators at the Schomburg Center, unveiling new Black Studies curricula and featuring a keynote conversation with Nicole Hannah-Jones. And June 18th, the Schomburg Center will hold its annual literary festival, online and in person. We'll paste links in the chat, but you can find all of this and more at schomburgcenter.org. The Conversations in Black Freedom Studies series is a space to talk about new works and ideas in Black social movement history. Tonight, we consider histories of slavery, capitalism, and empire. And to guide us in understanding this history, we're so fortunate to have 4 fabulous authors, and we'll introduce them in a moment. But first, we'll hear from the co-founder of this series, Jeanne Theoharis. It's good to see you, Jeanne.
Thank you. It's great to see you too, Brian. And it's great to be here with all of you. One of the things about Conversations in Black Freedom Studies virtual edition is getting to be with all of you around the country and the world, as we can see from the chat. This is actually our 10th season of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. Professor Kamosi Woodard and I started Conversations in Black Freedom Studies in collaboration with the Schomburg Center a decade ago to create a space where the public could engage with new works in Black history. With fewer and fewer public spaces available to engage with this new work and many bookstores closing, Conversations in Black Freedom Studies was conceived and has become a way to hear, learn, and discuss new work in Black history that helps us see the present more clearly. In many ways, Conversations has gotten to chart the expanding field of Black freedom studies over the past decade, and tonight's conversation provides another iteration in that ongoing expansion, taking us back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Kamosi took on a more emeritus role last year, and we are delighted to welcome Robyn Spencer, Associate Professor of History at Lehman College, to be the co-curator. We are so pleased the Schomburg Center has continued this series as one of the educational and public programming offerings. As usual, we're here the first Thursday of each month. Our next program, Thursday, May 5th, will be on racism and struggle in the post-civil rights era, featuring Elizabeth Hinton, Emily Hobson, Carol Anderson, and Daniel Lux. And our full lineup can always be found at blackfreedomstudies.org. But unfortunately, Robyn had an unexpected commitment come up and she won't be with us tonight. She shares my delight and excitement about tonight's conversation, and we are thrilled to have returning to Conversations, Brian Jones, who helped run the series for a number of years in his position as Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg. Welcome back, Brian.
Thank you, Jeanne. It's really great to be back, and I'm excited for tonight's conversation and to learn. And just a reminder, I do see people asking about it in the chat, that we're streaming to YouTube, and we'll put the link in the chat, the YouTube link, so you can share it with other people who might be interested in joining us as we get started. Just a note that the books our authors are talking about tonight are available at the Schomburg shop. We'll put that link in the chat as well, so you can purchase them if you don't have them already. And of course, you can follow this series on social media at Schomburg CBFS, which stands for Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. And now I'm delighted to introduce and welcome tonight's panelists. Adom Getachew is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago and author of Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. Peter James Hudson is Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at UCLA and author of Bankers and Empire, How Wall Street Colonized the Caribbean. Justene Edwards is Assistant Professor of History at University of Virginia and author of Unfree Markets, The Slaves Economy and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina. And last but not least, Daniel Immerwahr is History Professor at Northwestern and author of How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you for being here.
Welcome, welcome. So where we wanted to start tonight was sort of in your journey. So if each of you could tell us briefly how you came to this research topic, what concerns or commitments or questions guided your work to this present book that you're going to be talking about tonight. And Adom, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to join you and how this event is such a reflection of the global Black world. It's amazing to see all the people in the chat. But I would say that the main kind of drive of my work, both in this book, Worldmaking After Empire, and more generally, is to trace the kind of internationalist visions and imaginaries of Black politics, of Black political thought. And in this book, I was especially interested in thinking about how that internationalism plays out in the period of decolonization, and to critique a view of decolonization as simply about nation building, but to show the ways in which it was about reimagining the international order.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm supposed to talk about my book, Bankers and Empire, How Wall Street Colonized the Caribbean. And I think one of the things that's exciting for me about being here is I think people forget that Arturo Schomburg himself worked in the mailroom of the Bankers Trust Company. And the Bankers Trust Company is important to me because one of its founders was a guy named Alfred H. Wiggin. Alfred H. Wiggin later became in the 1920s, the president of the Chase Bank, which we now know as JP Morgan Chase Bank One. And it was through banks like the Chase, the Citibank, and other institutions that I framed Bankers and Empire, which is an attempt to understand how Wall Street was imbricated in U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean from the end of the 19th century to the 20th century, looking at both institutions and individuals, but also trying to understand it through the registers of law and kind of legal organization, as well as questions of the relationship between race and finance capitalism.
I am very excited to be here this evening. Thank you so much for the invitation. And in many ways, I realized through writing and researching Unfree Markets that I've always been interested in money, specifically who had it, who could accumulate it, and how some people could be wealthy while others were not. And so as I started graduate school and started taking more classes and reading much more broadly about the history of American slavery, I became more and more fascinated by instances that I was finding both in books that I was reading and then when I went into the archive. I was finding lots of evidence of enslaved men and women buying goods, trading goods, finding ways to earn money for themselves and their families. And I became increasingly interested in how this fit into what I thought of was the culture, the institution of American slavery. And so in my work, I seek to really disentangle and challenge this relationship between ideas of American democracy, American freedom, and the ways in which capitalism has evolved as an economic system in the United States. And so that is really the thrust of my research.
I'll echo my co-panelists' joy and pleasure in being here, especially hosted by the Schomburg, a place where I've spent many happy hours. my book is about the United States' territorial empire, so its colonies and its overseas bases. And I came to it as a teacher. I'd been teaching US history in the kind of standard way that one teaches US history. It was kind of the way I was trained as an undergraduate and then trained as a graduate student to teach. And then I went to Manila in the Philippines, and I'd known, of course, that the Philippines had been colonized by the United States and been a US colony for 50 years or so. But in some ways, it hadn't really been driven home to me. It's the difference between reading the lyrics and hearing the music. Being in Manila, I mean, you can't not notice that this is also a place that's been part of the United States that has a lot of the same patterns. In fact, Manila had been planned by the same urban planner who planned Chicago, where I live now. And that experience made me feel that I'd been teaching US history wrong, that I'd been teaching it just as the history of the continental blob. And I kind of realized that my stories didn't have room for places like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa. So I came back, this was many years ago, but I came back determined to tell US history in a broader sort of way. That's what got me into it.
Thank you. So this is the point in the evening when you all teach us something. And so we would like each of you to give us a window into your work and how it expands or changes or challenges how we see the history of slavery and capitalism, the broader context of the Atlantic world, and the history of colonialism, and particularly US colonialism, and the kinds of liberation and vision of freedom people across the diaspora forged. And Peter, we'll start with you.
Yeah, and it's a great question. It's also an aggregation of a lot of great questions that I hope I can do justice to it within the 5 minutes allotted to me. I think the first thing I would point to in terms of thinking about the research that I've done on Wall Street in the Caribbean is I don't think you can understand that history without understanding a history of the relationship between slavery and the formation of capitalism in the United States. And what I found is that that relationship comes in kind of through two vectors. First, it's through the relationship of J.P. Morgan Chase, of Lehman Brothers, of Brown Brothers, to slavery in the U.S. South in the 19th century. Often these institutions were founded by merchants involved in the cotton trade. They accumulated enough capital from the profits from cotton grown by enslaved Africans to transform themselves by the end of the 19th century into the kind of financiers that dominate my book and that move out into the Caribbean, into Latin America, into Asia, into the Philippines, etc. The other way that we want to look at this is by understanding that the history of capitalism and slavery in the United States is also a history of capitalism and slavery in the Caribbean. And so Citibank, for me, is the most kind of egregious example of this. When it was kind of developing in the early 19th century, it had extremely close ties to Cuban sugar planters and a lot. And I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but some of its earliest large accumulation came from the profits of slave-grown sugar under the regime of Moses Taylor. Later, Charles Stillman, who was the president of the bank, made a lot of money during the Civil War for running cotton around the blockade. And so you can see those links there. And so on one level, there's this relationship between slavery in the South, slavery in the Caribbean, and the development of finance capitalism in the 20th century. We could say Wall Street, but also in Philadelphia, in New Orleans, in Boston. But we also can see how this money is kind of plowed into, first of all, the settler colonialism of the US West and the kind of expansion of these institutions westward. And then secondly, at the end of the 20th century, the expansion of formal colonialism into Cuba, into Puerto Rico, into the Dominican Republic, into Nicaragua, into Haiti, into the Philippines, into China, etc. And this becomes the kind of moment of Wall Street's kind of imperial presence and growth from about 1898 onwards. I'm not sure how much time, but I think I'll leave it at that and hope we can return to some of these things in the questions.
I think that kind of along with Peter, thinking about the longer history of the relationship between slavery and capitalism. In my work, what I do in Unfree Markets is I'm really trying to encourage us, really force us to think critically about the role of African Americans in the rise of American capitalism. There's been some really interesting work published in the last 10 years or so that have really explored the connections between slavery and the roots of capitalism in the United States. And those studies are really important to contributing knowledge to our understanding of how this relationship functioned. But those analyses, in my estimation, by and large, focused on those with political economic power in American society in the 19th century. And so we're talking about slaveholders, slave traders, bankers and politicians who espouse pro-slavery beliefs. But by thinking about the rise of American capitalism from the people at the top, mainly wealthy, influential white men, we miss the role of people of African descent, specifically enslaved men and women, who were participating actively by force in the building of this new nation. And so in my work, I do offer a different perspective by exploring the emergence of American capitalism through the experiences of enslaved men and women in a state like South Carolina, where especially in the 19th century, slaveholders and politicians in South Carolina were in the vanguard, really at the forefront of pro-slavery activism. I'm encouraging us to think not only about the contributions that enslaved men and women made to the growth of the American economy and the nation writ large, but I encourage us to think about them as economic actors. They were not merely property. Enslaved men and women were hustlers by and large. They figured out ways to make money, to earn wages. They were entrepreneurs. They traded amongst themselves with poor whites. They even traded with their enslavers, which is something I find fascinating. And so what this tells me, and all of this is to say, is that enslaved men and women were investing in the supposed benefits of American capitalism. They worked, they dedicated their free time to, again, making money for themselves and their families. They worked to make their lives better materially in any way that they could. But the one thing that, by and large, most enslaved men and women could not do was purchase the one thing that all enslaved men and women wanted, and that was their own liberation. And so I find that the struggles that the enslaved had with not just participating as actors in their local capitalist economies, but the fact that they couldn't even buy their own freedom was really important. And so in my book, what I do is I say that capitalism did not mean freedom for the enslaved. And though they could make money, they could save money, they could buy goods, they by and large remained in slavery. And so I contend in the book that capitalist enterprise actually proved to be a destructive force in the lives of enslaved people. And I show that their investments in their own networks of trade and commerce, in their own economic pursuits, actually kept them, what we would say, shackled to the exploitative regime that really shaped their lives in violent ways. And this extends to what we see occur in the Reconstruction period as well. The enslaved entered the period of freedom by and large without capital, without property, and they continued to forge ties and connections amongst themselves to shield themselves from the unpredictability of the capitalist economy. They sought to strive for themselves to leverage political rights, but they were still faced with increasing difficulties. And so in my book and in my scholarship at large, I encourage all of us to really disentangle this cozy relationship that I think we often have in American culture between investments in capitalism and access to political rights.
Thanks so much. I think that the main thing that I'd want to tell you about my book is that or about my research, is that it's encouraged me to think of the space of the United States differently. I think if you were to ask most people in the country, or indeed anywhere in the world, to map the United States in their minds, I think the image that they would mentally map would be that sort of familiar shape, that contiguous blob. And US historians know that hasn't been the shape of the country for the whole time, and that it's only through a series of wars and purchases and indigenous dispossessions that the United States came to achieve that shape, with the ratification of the Gadsden Purchase in 1854, if you're being precise. But I think what we don't often say, or don't often say enough, is that even after the United States got that shape, it held it for only 3 years. There's only 3 years of history where that's the picture of the country, because the United States just kept expanding. After it expanded within North America, it expanded overseas. First taking a series of uninhabited islands, then taking Alaska, which is by no means uninhabited and is absolutely huge, to the point where by the end of the 19th century, the United States really had a formidable colonial empire. And that's a colonial empire that I think has a way of receding to the background when people tell the story of US history. And I think it oughtn't, both just on sort of moral grounds, but also on analytical ones as well. When you realize that the United States is not just the mainland, but is actually a much larger and dynamic and changing place whose borders dance across the Caribbean, the Arctic, and the Pacific, US history comes out differently, and I think should come out differently. The clearest example that I have of that, for me the most resonant, is World War II. And the way that we in the United States often tell the story of World War II is that it's a war that started when the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor, the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. That was the only place that the United States was attacked, but that attack nevertheless pulled the United States into the war. And it was a war that was fought over there. So GIs went abroad and they fought the war, and on the home front, Rosie's riveted, et cetera. And that story, that's how I learned it, really only makes sense if you have a blinkered understanding of what the United States is. First, that Pearl Harbor attack wasn't just an attack on a naval base in Hawaii. It was attack in the US's whole Pacific Empire. So within hours, as part of the same event, the Japanese attacked Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines, which is the largest colony that the United States ever held. And the Japanese didn't just attack the Philippines, they invaded and conquered it, as they did actually many parts of the US Pacific Empire. And millions of people, millions of US nationals found themselves in a battlefield, which is an extremely dangerous place to be. World War II in the Philippines, I tell the story in my book, and I don't want to sort of go into all the grim details, which can get a little grim, but World War II in the Philippines killed 1.5 or 6 million people, we think, which is the bloodiest event that has ever taken place on US soil. It's like 2 civil wars. And it's infrequently in textbooks. You often won't find it in US history textbooks. And I mean, that's kind of shocking to me, but I think it speaks to the way in which we've had a racially blinkered sense of the United States, not just for too long of, what people matter, but also what places matter and what places count as the United States and what places count as quote unquote American for the purposes of US history. So that's something that I've been eager with a number of other scholars to change, to help us to see the United States differently in a very sort of literal, physical kind of way.
Great. In many ways, my book is also very much concerned with the post-World War II period and to this period known as decolonization, the end of formal empire across the world. And I tell the story specifically from a set of African and Caribbean perspectives through figures like Eric Williams and Michael Manley, Kwame Nkrumah, and Julius Nyerere. One of the first kind of intervention of the book is to ask us, what was empire as a political problem? In order to understand what people's imaginations of freedom are, we have to understand the problems or their critiques of the kinds of domination they faced. And so the book makes the argument that we've received a very limited conception of empire, one in which empire constitutes a structure of alien rule, where, say, Britain rules Jamaica or Ghana, and that when we picture empire in those terms, then we have a limited conception of what self-determination is, namely that self-determination involves freedom from, independence from the metropole, from Britain in this case. I try to show that in the interwar period, a wide variety of anti-colonial critics, Black anti-colonial critics, developed a conception of empire as a structure of unequal integration and racial hierarchy. And they started in the same places that Justine and Peter were talking about. They had a longue durée view of the world order as having begun with the transatlantic slave trade, and with that slave trade having constructed a set of unequal relationships between Africa and the Caribbean and the rest of the world. And in particular, they would come to think through how this structure of unequal legal and economic integration came to shape Black sovereignty. So for them, and in the interwar period, the three kind of exemplary spaces of Black sovereignty, Haiti, Ethiopia, and Liberia, would all find themselves subject to various forms of domination. Haiti was under US occupation for 19 years. Liberia would almost be intervened in by the United States, and Ethiopia would, of course, come under Italian occupation in 1935. So this kind of wider conception of empire as international racial hierarchy came to shape a much more expansive vision of what self-determination would require. It became clear to a variety of figures that simply achieving formal independence, simply securing sovereignty alone, would be an insufficient guarantee of independence. So the book's then contribution around what anti-colonial self-determination looks like is to chart the ways in which it was a project of what I call world-making. And this world-making vision of anti-colonialism was an effort to secure or realize for the first time an egalitarian international order. And it had roughly three components. One was a kind of legal component in which nationalists sought to secure a universal and internationally recognized right to self-determination that would, for the first time, mean that all peoples had a right to independence, and that sovereign equality was truly a universal principle. Second was the political dimension, which was the formation of regional federations. The West Indies Federation, which lasted briefly from 1958 to 1962, and attempts at this moment also to inaugurate a United States of Africa. These federations were attempts to integrate African and Caribbean states with each other, so in the hopes of escaping relations of economic dependence between kind of post-colonial states and the global North. And then finally, the new international economic order, which was really the only and the most ambitious program of global economic redistribution, I think, ever attempted, an attempt to think about the world order as really one unequal economic unit, and to imagine structures and processes of economic redistribution that would equalize those sets of relations. So together, this kind of picture, to me, it's really important because, one, it shows the ways in which Black internationalism or Pan-Africanism had an institutional imaginary, right? It wasn't simply about solidarities and a set of relationships, but it really had a vision of what kinds of institutional forms would be necessary to realize independence and equality. And I was very interested in kind of elevating this institutional imagination. The second thing I would say is that the kind of, a very standard story about the international order, and one that's become very popular in this period of kind of mourning the crisis of the liberal international order, is that the kind of universal principles of equality, independence that we associate with the international order are often linked to figures like Woodrow Wilson or to a European inventions. But the book really shows that it was African and Caribbean statesmen and their kind of third world allies who really advanced a vision of international equality. And in fact, the most ambitious visions of what global equality would require, in my view, have still, they set the standard for what that requires and what that would entail.
Thank you. As we can see, we are joined by hundreds of people all over the country and the world. You can see in the chat. I want to ask our audience to start putting your questions, so the panelists in the chat, so we will get to them in a few minutes, but just to start thinking about what you might want to ask. Our third question brings us into the present, right? Questions of political economy, of empire, are increasingly urgent as connections between capitalism, war, and empire play out in current events, on our TV, sort of every day, seemingly. And so what we wanted to sort of ask was, how does the history you write give us ways to think about where we are today, both in this country and the world, and where we might go from here? If you could kind of use your research, part of the whole, as I was saying in the beginning, kind of founding purpose of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies was the kind of history we need to see the present more clearly. So how does your research help us see the present more clearly? And Justene, we'll start with you.
I'll start it off. Such a great question. Well, one of the ideas that I hope my work really forces us to think about is the long history of economic inequality in America, especially as it relates to the racial wealth gap. And to realize that perhaps too often, especially when politicians or pundits talk about the racial wealth gap, the conversation often feels very presentist and revolves around, let's say, the economic challenges of racial discrimination or even institutional racism. And while I recognize that these debates are incredibly important, I think that they often miss a longer history of racism and exclusion, what historians like myself call the afterlife of slavery, embedded very clearly within American society. And so to fully understand why racial and economic inequality combined continues to persist, continues to be such a visible aspect of the fabric of American culture, which should hopefully make us all feel very uncomfortable. I hope that my work encourages us to think about the lasting influence of slavery within American culture and American society. So that maybe our, again, quick embrace of capitalist ideas or the free market or even trickle-down economics, hopefully it forces us to finally realize that, one, those things don't necessarily work if our broader goals and concerns have to do with creating a more equitable society. But these very clear systemic economic and racial problems do have a longer history, a longer trajectory, and a longer history that requires us to fully understand not just the history of slavery, but the ways in which slavery as an institution continued to influence economic and race relations into the late 19th, the 20th, and even the 21st centuries. And so just because we have more Black millionaires, perhaps even billionaires, and even though we've elected a Black president, that does not mean that these this problem of racial and economic inequality will just go away. And so I think to understand why it continues to persist, especially the racial wealth gap, I think we need to take a longue durée view of the ways in which slavery continued to influence American culture and American society, especially along economic lines.
Great. I'm going to give the opposite kind of answer that Justine just gave. So Justine said, we need, when we look at the present, to understand its deep roots in the past. Totally agreed. My topic is a little weird with regard to that, in that a lot of people think that empire, at least colonial empire, is a back then problem, right? You know, it used to be that powerful countries claimed colonies, and that doesn't happen anymore, except with a few, recent border invasions. But that's not right. That's not really true. So I guess what I'm going to suggest is that the thing that we know from the past is actually ongoing in the present. First, in a very straightforward way, the United States has 5 inhabited territories. Millions of people live in them. And I think that's really important to hold on to. Puerto Rico is the largest and most prominent. But looking at territory and understanding how the United States exerts its power through space, not just through money or other modalities of power that we're used to, made it easier for me to think hard about the fact that the United States has, we think, 750 military bases in foreign and overseas, in foreign countries, and a smaller number in territories. If you add all those up, or at least all the ones that the Pentagon admits to having, and you mash them all together in terms of their acreage, we're talking about an area that's smaller than Houston. It's not huge, but those little specks of semi-sovereignty littered around the planet are really important. They're important for the United States, moving its battleships around and projecting power, but they're also really important for the people who live in the shadow of US bases and whose countries are sort of punctured, or the sovereignty of those countries is punctured in ways that I think Adom could speak very well to, by the physical presence of the United States, and which is, for me, just a reminder that empire is not a yesterday problem. It is still really an ongoing one, and one that is particularly located in the outsized global power of the United States.
Yeah, that's a good segue to me. I think in some ways, a lot of my work is also about thinking about the legacies of imperialism and the ways in which imperial relations persist. So part of what I was saying about rethinking empire as this structure of unequal integration is to say that it can take a variety of institutional forms, right? So it can look like the projection of power through bases all over the world. It can look like the forms of structural adjustment that many post-colonial states were subject to in the kind of 1980s. But I want to just maybe focus on 2 lessons that stem from a particular analytic, I think, that the anti-colonial political thought I look at provides. And that analytic is a view of a refusal to bifurcate the domestic sphere and the international sphere, right? A resistance to the idea that the national and the international are kind of hermetically sealed spaces in which, we constitute ourselves as nations, and then we engage in something called international politics, right? If you study politics, the world from Africa or the Caribbean, you can't hold on to that view of a kind of hermetically sealed nation that then interacts with the international. So I think this provides 2 kinds of lessons. One is, I think, in our own, from the global North perspective, from the United States, there's a kind of narrative we tell about the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s and onwards, in which the state is no longer, say, capable of kind of managing the economy under the forces of kind of globalization, right? But if we look again from the perspective of a Jamaica, there's a longue durée conception of the ways in which actually forms of national sovereignty have been incapable of organizing a national economy, right? So that kind of a crisis of sovereignty originates and existed in the Caribbean and in Africa before it appears on the stage. And there's also already a lot of creative thinking about how one might respond to those crises and challenges. So that's one. I think the second is, a way of thinking about the relationship between the domestic and the international, captured by the term neocolonialism, coined initially by Kwame Nkrumah. I think a lot of times, and my students take this view, the way we've received kind of that term neocolonialism is to think about, the forms of external domination that persist, whether that's in military interventions or covert operations or the kinds of economic coercion that produced by unequal relations. But I think the most important insight of Nkrumah's concept is actually the ways in which he discusses how the set of external relationships structure and transform internal relations, right? The anxiety for him is that this set of external or international dependencies mean that the post-colonial elite who run the state, rather than being responsive to and beholden to a domestic population, are responsive and beholden to an external powers, right? So it's about the distortion of political relations of accountability within the state. And I think that's really important because it provides a way of thinking about crises in the post-colonial world as occurring in a kind of interaction within, like in interactions that span the domestic and the international. So we don't have to have a story in which all the action and all the power is being done by the United States or by other external forces, but we can imagine how there's a set of interactions between in that particular story of neocolonialism between sort of post-colonial elites and kind of international institutions, corporations, actors that serve to both reproduce international inequality and exacerbate domestic forms of inequality.
Sorry. I'd like to push back slightly against the question, because I think it's a mistake to say that the question of imperialism is a matter of increasing urgency, or it's increasingly urgent that we talk about it. I think if you ask the question of imperialism from the perspective of Port-au-Prince or Baghdad, it's not something that's recent. It's not something that's become urgent now. I think in the United States, the question of imperialism and the political economy of imperialism is becoming increasingly urgent because that imperialism is in crisis. And I think that crisis we're seeing right now in terms of the crisis of the standing of the dollar in the US economy in the wider world. And I want to circle back to that. But I want to answer that question through two things. First of all, I want to suggest that the work that Daniel's doing in terms of the kind of geographic imagination or the cartography of US imperialism is so important for us to look beyond the kind of hegemonic or standard map that we hold in our imaginations of the United States and start to look at a series of different capitals and boundary lines and nodes which hold together the world. For me, the most important one, the first one that we should look at, is the global US military commands that have carved up the world into different sections. The ones that I'm most familiar with are AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM, which covers much of the Caribbean and parts of Central and Latin America. We should also look at the way that NATO carves up the world in particular ways. We could look at the way that the IMF carves up the world in particular ways, that the World Bank has carved up the world in particular ways, and understand that the United States and United States imperialism is behind all of these institutions and has a hegemonic role in supporting all of these institutions. And these cartographies are in place in large part to hold together or subtend, as some people would say, the political economy of American capitalism. And I think if you look at the research that's been issued through the Black Alliance for Peace on AFRICOM or SOUTHCOM or on NATO, you'll get a very, very clear example of that. So I think that's important to think about that cartographic example. The second question, the second response, I would say, when we're talking about the political economy of empire, is to do that ancient methodology of following the money. And I think one thing we don't do enough as students of US imperialism is to go to some of the very public documents about military spending in this country. We've just seen the passage of a nearly $1 trillion military defense bill. How many contractors do we know about them? Who are the contractors behind them? Why don't we start to do the forensic work as professors and students to break that down and see how that both moves internationally through Stinger missiles and other forms, but also through local jobs, and think about that domestic international link that Adom is asking us to look at. And finally, I would also say that for me, the question of following the money, which is at the center of Bankers and Empire, is to look at Wall Street and to look at banks. I don't think most people realize that Citigroup is over 200 years old. This is then an institution that's been involved in almost every single part of the development of the US economy over 2 centuries and still remains there. What do we know about what Citibank has done internationally? What do we know about what JP Morgan Chase has done internationally? What do we know about the way that these institutions have been financing not just American corporate power, but American military power? And finally, what do we know about their role in supporting the standing of the dollar internationally? And I think that we need to be prepared as people who live in the United States for what the potential sliding of the dollar internationally is going to mean for all of our lives. So I think the thing is to do this kind of cartographic work, but also to do the political economy work of following the money.
Wow. This is a fabulous conversation. There's so many threads, and I'm trying to keep track of all of the questions that are popping up in the chat. So keep those coming. We'll get to those in a moment. Let me ask one last question before we go to audience questions, which is offer you each an opportunity to introduce us to a character, a person, a human story that you've encountered in your research that you think helps us to understand your work, and that you think we need to know more about. Can you illuminate someone's story for our audience, starting with Daniel?
Yeah, there's a version of this where I pick a obscure figure and try to resuscitate them. But for me, the person that immediately flew to mind is someone who some people have heard of a lot, and then there are a lot of people who haven't heard of him at all. His name, which I'll just drop in the chat, is Pedro Albizu Campos, and he is a absolutely crucial, titanic figure within Puerto Rican history. And yet I've found that a lot of people on the US mainland who are not Puerto Rican just have very little sense of who he was. I'm not going to go through his biography, but I'll just give a few points that suggest to me that it is kind of astonishing the way that his memory about him has been suppressed for a lot of people, although certainly not all. One is, so he started out as a kind of ambivalent nationalist, ambivalent in the sense of he wasn't sure the tactics that would be appropriate to Puerto Rican nationalism, partly because he trusted Woodrow Wilson that Puerto Rican independence might come peaceably. He came to be disappointed, and indeed bitterly disappointed by that, and led the Puerto Rican nationalist movement on a path of violent resistance, which included some of its most prominent acts were attacking Citibank locations and indeed bombing them. This escalated so that he was sort of in and out of prison, and escalated to the point where in 1950 he led a 7-city revolt that required air power to be suppressed. One of the few times the US state has used air power against its own citizens. The move bombing in Philadelphia is another really good example, and the bombings in Tulsa in 1921 as well. That 7-city revolt culminated in assassins coming to Washington, D.C. and seeking to assassinate and almost assassinating Harry Truman, and coming very close to doing so. And that was the reason that Truman gave for not running for re-election 4 years later, Albizu's followers shot up Congress while it was in session and shot 5 congresspeople, nearly killing one. These are the kind of, I don't want to say this as a kind of highlight reel. These are obviously the most extreme moments, but these moments signal to me that it is astonishing that so few people in the US mainland have any clue who this guy is. And that astonishment needs a major caveat, which is that there's a street named after him in Chicago, and that street leads to a school that's named after him in Chicago. There's also a public school named after him in West Harlem. There are large populations in the United States who know exactly who Pedro Albizu Campos is. And yet, the last time I checked the pages of the American Historical Review and the Journal of American History, which are the 2 largest organs for historical research for historians in the United States and historians of the United States, I did not find one printing of Pedro Albizu Campos's name. His name, like Voldemort, does not appear once. And so that strikes me as someone who I think a lot of people could profitably know more about.
Great. So my pick is Samir Amin, and I will also put him on. And he's not a person who actually makes a brief appearance in the book. He's not a central character in my book, but Samir Amin is an Egyptian Marxist economist. He wrote a very important set of books in the 1970s that would help to shape what is known as kind of dependency theory, these set of arguments that thought about the kind of world system as a whole and the place of the third world. So one is accumulation on a world scale, unequal development, and later a book called Delinking. So I want to highlight him both as a figure, but also as a representative of what we might call a kind of third world social science, right? So Samir Amin also served in a variety of roles as advisor in Mali, in Senegal. He would also be really important in the founding of Cadastria, which is the kind of African Social Science Research Council in the 1970s. And I think he's an important figure to highlight because the kind of moment of decolonization was not simply a kind of political and economic project. It was also an intellectual project. It was about how to create new forms of knowledge that attended to the specific political and economic predicaments of the third world, and that tried to develop, or to conceptualize models of development, models of state making for the third world. So I think one of the many tragedies of the kind of failure collapse of the project of anti-colonial world making is also the ways in which the kind of spaces for third world knowledge production, universities across Africa were defunded, marginalized. So I think Samir Amin, along with a kind of cohort of third world social scientists in the and heterodox economists in particular, should be kind of returned to, both as kind of offering insights into the kind of predicaments I was describing about unequal integration, but also as models for what kind of the debates that we're having now about decolonizing the university or decolonizing knowledge, what that project looked like, what it meant, what it required in the period of decolonization. I think there are important lessons to be had by turning to that particular period and to a variety of alternative sites and modes of knowledge production.
Those are amazing answers, I have to say. For me, when I started writing and researching bankers and empire, one of the first things I tried to do was read the autobiographies of some of the kind of more prominent bankers in the nation at the early 20th century, people like J.P. Morgan and James Stillman. And in reading those biographies, obviously they're talking about how great these individuals are, but they also, you realize that they're not on the ground in the Caribbean doing the real work of bankers, of banking, of local banking. And I realized that there was a whole kind of category, many of them who were kind of went through the Citibank at one time, a category of bankers that I called rogue bankers, who were these guys who were trained in country banks in the West and in the South, who had gone to the Philippines, had gone to Cuba, gone to Puerto Rico, and then kind of moved up the Citibank hierarchy. So there's individuals like Roger Farnham, who was effectively instrumental in the US occupation of Haiti. There was Samuel Miller Jarvis and Roland Ray Conklin, who were the first American bankers to set a flag down in Cuba. There's a figure like Joseph H. Durrell, who was crucial for Bankers and Empire, because he left these massive volumes and archives that detailed his entire career as a banker, from his time at the country bank in Enid, Oklahoma, to the period when he was the vice president of all of Citibank's international operations and had audiences with Mussolini and Trujillo, and was a correspondent with Machado in Cuba. But I have to say, in saying that, Daniel has kind of pushed me off stream here with his discussion of Campos, who is a figure that appears in Bankers and Empire. And actually, in the 1930s, the local branch manager of the Puerto Rican branch of the Citibank threatened to burn Pedro Albizu Campos alive, and they were instrumental in having him jailed. But I think Campos, along with someone like Arturo Schomburg and other people, for me, represent these figures, Black figures, people of African descent, who represented the expansion of white capitalism into the Caribbean and elsewhere. And so the Bankers and Empire ends by talking about Black resistance to finance capitalism, Black resistance to racial capitalism. And I think then, if I'm going to leave our audience with one figure who's important in all of this, is the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist George Padmore, who in his writings from really from the mid-1920s, when he was a student at Fisk University, up until his death in Ghana, was, as Adom more than anyone knows, writing a kind of an anti-imperial geography against finance capital for Black sovereignty, and he becomes a very important figure in Bankers and Empire in developing a different Pan-African world than the one that's begun, than the world that started in Wall Street.
Well, I will round out our conversation with one final person, one final historical figure. If you read Unfree Markets, you'll notice that when I talk about an enslaved person, I rarely use their last names, because that's what's reflected in the archive, unfortunately. But the historical figure that actually evolved to be a bigger part of the book is Denmark Vesey. And his story is so fascinating, not just because of what's revealed in the historical record about his extraordinary life, but in a way too, how historians have kind of been debating how his life ended, essentially. So Denmark Vesey's, again, his life was fascinating. It was also fraught. He was born in St. Thomas in the 1760s. When he was a teenager, he was purchased by a slave trader who sold him to an enslaver in Saint-Domingue, modern day Haiti. I believe that he probably was figuring out how to get out of a very violent, a very kind of tortuous situation, because as many of us know, the experience of being an enslaved person in Saint-Domingue, especially in the 1760s and 1770s, was a very violent experience. I believe that he kind of faked an illness, and so his enslaver in Saint-Domingue sold him to the same slave trader who sold him in the first place in Saint-Domingue. He and the slave trader traveled together to Charleston, where they lived in Charleston together, Denmark Vesey as an enslaved person. He ended up buying a lottery ticket in November of 1799. He ended up winning the lottery, $1,500, which at the end of the 18th century was an astounding amount of money. He negotiated with his enslavers to purchase his own freedom for $600, which he did. And so he entered the year 1800 as a free man. He lived in Charleston among a kind of mixed community of free Blacks and enslaved men and women. And he, in 1822, was credited with planning a slave insurrection. Now, this is where the this is where historians have put this up for debate, but the slave insurrection was subsequently foiled, and he and a number of other enslaved men predominantly were rounded up, caught, and executed for planning an insurrection in the city. Now, Vesey's story, I think, is fascinating for a variety of reasons, not just because of how exceptional it was. Not only did he kind of work on his own to earn wages to even buy a lottery ticket, but in a kind of twist of fortune, he won the lottery. And not just that, the managers of the lottery, who were white, actually allowed him to keep the money, a fact that still kind of astounds me today. But at the same time, what Vesey represented, I think, was really a threat, especially for whites in Charleston and South Carolina writ large, who were afraid of a free Black man with access to money, access to a community of people, and what that meant for not just the stability of slavery, but what it meant for whiteness within a slave society. And so he was seen as a threat, and he was seen again as a free Black man with money and in a society absolutely dominated by slavery that posed a real threat. And so he was executed for that fear. And so I think that Vesey's life actually evolved to be a larger part of Unfree Markets than I expected it to be at the beginning. At first, it was kind of a part of a chapter, but as I started to probe and ask more questions, Vesey's life and his legacy kind of took on a larger meaning within the structure of the book. And so hopefully you will all do a bit of research, perhaps read chapter 4, I believe, of Unfree Markets, and learn a little bit more about Vesey and his legacy in South Carolina and in the nation writ large.
Thank you so much, all of you, for these responses and prompts. So we have about 20 minutes left to try to smash together a bunch of questions, or rather, I'm going to try to smash together a bunch of questions to get more in. I'm seeing some threads, and so let me try to combine them as much as possible into kind of one question that you can each respond to. The first one, I think, is about a thread of questions that are all about the ways out of capitalism. What are the ways that your research points to ways out? And let me give you a flavor from some of the questions. You can see the texture of this. One person asks about cooperatives. Are these a step away from capitalism? How are we discarding the status quo? Are they a way of disengaging from capitalism? Another, pointed more specifically to Justine, is about enslaved women trying to buy their freedom, run businesses. Did this form of resistance and agency help these women occupy important spaces in society, or merely tie them in more firmly to the status quo? A lot of these questions kind of turn on this. Is this actually a enchaining us to the status quo in some way, or is this a way out? Another one asks, where do we start? It seems like our current structures are upholding the legacy of slavery and empire. So where do we start? Is it time for an anti-capitalist or anti-colonial movements on a national or international scale? Another asks about reparations. Are the panelists for reparations? Are reparations a solution? In any way, do they move the needle on these questions? Who wants to begin?
I mean, I'll start. So I think I said earlier that I thought, the new international economic order, this project of the 1970s, was really the most ambitious project at trying to think about global economic redistribution. I should say, however, about that project, it was not an anti-capitalist project, right? It's one that took at face value in some ways the structure of global trade as it was, right? And in many ways, and I make this argument in the book, it framed its project of redistribution along the lines of the welfare state, right? Of trying to reduce inequalities, but not necessarily abolish the structure, the kind of binary position of worker and capital, or in this case, global North and global South. Figures like Samir Amin, Immanuel Wallerstein, who were kind of world systems theorists in this period, would have a deep critique of this. I mean, they thought the new international economic order was a kind of fantasy, that it would only kind of work to further entrench inequalities rather than lead to the forms of equality that the advocates argued for. And they would argue for, as Samir Amin put it, delinking, right? Trying to extract post-colonial states from their embeddedness in global economies and reorient them towards more South-South relations, right? Global South-South relations. So I think, I find very compelling the kind of scale at which the new international economic order is pitched and its global kind of conception. But I think this critique has really it makes a really important intervention about the limits of that project. I also think there are very specific things about our moment, the kind of environmental crisis that we're all living in, the fact that we can't hold on to an optimism about economic growth as the way towards equality in a way that those figures could in the 1970s, that really, I think, require us to think much more imaginatively about different ways of organizing the economy. So I would say in this moment, I really turn to kind of like pioneers of kind of environmental justice movements, the combination also, I think, of environmental justice and indigenous rights movements for ways of thinking about relationships to land and organizing of economies that are distinct, that are kind of anti-capitalist and non-capitalist. I also think, just to say something about the reparations point, I do think that reparations is a really important language, and I want to recommend a book by Olufemi Taiwo, who's a philosopher at Georgetown, who's just written a book about reparations. I think it's called Reconsidering Reparations, which really makes the case for how reparations, as it's concerned with kind of past injustice, actually makes it possible to imagine future potentialities, right? And that reparations is a project of linking pasts and futures. I think another really important thing about reparations claims, say, for instance, the reparation claims of the Caribbean community vis-a-vis Britain, France, and the other kind of colonizing states, is that it is a kind of language, a political claim, a political viewpoint that turns around the language of debt, right? So, who's indebted to who owes who what, right? And one that kind of by projecting, by asking us to look out from 400 years of history, makes the sovereign debt that Jamaica holds or whatever look kind of like a drop in the bucket compared to to what is owed to Jamaica, say, when considered from that 400-year history. So I think, reparations is a really important, part of rethinking, thinking about alternatives or imagining new futures.
Others want to jump in on this? Don't be shy.
I think there's a way in which it's really easy to be grim about the past. I mean, the past is so full of oppressive institutions, and then we often stress the continuities, and we see them. We've done this already, and I've done this. But I don't think I'd be a historian if I didn't think change was possible, and if I thought that, the past was the present, just with different outfits. That's sort of the Flintstones theory of history. And the oppressive and subordinating institutions that I've most had my eye on in my research, those of empire, have really changed, and really changed in living memory. In 1940, about 1 in 3 humans on the planet was colonized. And by 1970, it was more like 1 in 50. And that's a serious movement, often armed movement, undertaken by anti-imperial activists that was global and successful, and, as Adom fully knows, incomplete in the sense that the structures of domination maintained. But I think to lose sight of those kinds of possibilities would, it actually makes activism hard. This feels like an exciting moment to me. I mean, obviously it's a terrifying moment, especially with global warming, but this feels, thinking about empire more largely in some of the ways that Adom pointed our attention to, this feels like a time when we can name it, and when it's, politically possible to talk about the contours of stark international inequalities and how they're enforced. When I started writing my book, more than 10 years ago, it was really hard to get conversations going or to see them happening in the newspaper. Now it's not. And that doesn't solve all the problems by any means, but I do feel like not only is change possible, but in some really fundamental ways, we're watching it happen already.
If I could jump in, I would say I fully support the call for reparations, and I would argue, I haven't read Olufemi Taiwo's book, but I would argue that the claim for reparations isn't simply one of repair for the past. I think it's also repair for ongoing racist practices into the present, and I think we need to consider. We need to consider 2 things. One is that in every society where slavery ended, we know that the enslaved received nothing but more racism. Secondly, we also know that if you look at the case of England, when the Abolition Act was also an act for slavery reparations to the slavers. So they received what was the biggest bailout in British history. People who owned slaves in the Caribbean were paid. First of all, they received a cash payment based on how many slaves they owned, and secondly, they received bonds, British government bonds, which were financed by the Rothschilds, and which continued to issue dividends to the descendants of the slavers up until 2015. And so when we're talking about reparations, this is in 1833. This is a couple of years ago. And so I think there needs to be a really expanded conversation about reparations on an international scale. And I know a lot of people will make the argument, and I think the California Reparations Committee recently made the argument that reparations should only go to the direct descendants of people who were enslaved in the United States during a certain period. I believe that they should go to all Black people and Indigenous people up until the present, because if you start to look at the entangled histories of slavery throughout the Caribbean, the United States, Latin America, and Africa, it becomes very twisted. I kind of share the many of the doomsday concerns around the imminent collapse of the earth writ large due to environmental reasons, but I also feel that the hope, the possibility that I see is in what Starbucks workers have done, the union organizing there, what Amazon workers are trying to do, what teachers throughout the country are trying to do, and what organizations like Cooperation Jackson are trying to do, operating on a small scale, gaining power on whatever shop floor and in whatever neighborhood that you work in and for, and then maybe these small collectives, these fugitive bands of labor organizers can begin to gain power on an international level, and ask some of these big questions about the end of capitalism.
Thank you so much. Let me try to, Justine, sorry, go ahead.
So I just briefly, in the few minutes we have left, I'll only take maybe 2 minutes. I'll briefly say that I think conversations about reparations have to be held at the highest levels of the federal government. And I think until we have politicians, until we have elected officials really willing to even say reparations in a way that they acknowledge the past sins of the nation and the federal government, then I think it's going to be a real challenge. And so I think that is the major hurdle. We have to have an acknowledgement of past wrongs and an acknowledgement of the ways in which those wrongs continue to influence Black and Brown people in the nation. And this, I think, is such an important conversation, especially as we continue to talk about racism and discrimination of all kinds. But there has to be a very public pronouncement and acknowledgement of those past wrongs in a way that even will allow for the kind of policy recommendations to how to think about the practicalities of reparations to be a reality.
Lightning round. Less than 1 minute from each of you, please. There are a number of questions that have to do with the way that all of these conversations happen in educational institutions, your institutions in K-12, the pushback against the boogeyman of critical race theory, what you see your role as intellectuals trying to get different kinds of history. There seems to be a pushback against history. Somebody notes, speaking of reparations, the connection of universities have, in many cases, to the history of slavery, benefiting from their origins lying in slavery, and asking about what ordinary people can do to support more truthful and more and better teaching and learning about the past in all kinds of educational institutions. Big question, but let's see if we can do it in rapid fire.
The thing that I would say is, I think part of it is teaching history. I don't think we're trying to teach accurate history. I think what we're trying to do is teach students how to interpret history. And I think the one thing that I see happening right now is the kind of decline of media literacy over the last 20 or 30 years is incredible. And I think we need to return to teaching how to read effectively, how to read text, how to read media, how to do that primal work of cultural study.
Thank you.
I would just say, that for those of us, in some ways, K through 12 has been at the forefront of this struggle over critical race theory. It's the space where politicians, of course, have easy access for intervention, but clearly it's coming for all of us very quickly, very fast. And I think, for those of us within universities, it behooves us to learn lessons from the ways in which teachers have been organizing over the last few years. Peter mentioned this already, and to also see ourselves build meaningful kind of relationships with K through 12 teachers, right? Both from a political perspective about how to fight together against this, but also how to share resources, right? How to think about how, spaces like the University of Chicago, very wealthy institution on the South Side, how those of us on the inside might be able to create new kinds of relationships for the distribution of resources, for the, sharing of knowledge, et cetera, that disrupts, an inside-outside positioning.
I'd like to just add to that. I totally agree. It's there's a way in which professors can just sort of get really interested in professoring and regard with some intellectual disdain sometimes the work that happens in K-12. I think not only do we need to create political solidarities, Adom's right. It's happening there. It's going to happen in higher education also, but actually like deep intellectual solidarities, and to recognize that part of the work that we're trying to do in changing narratives can't just be limited to higher education, can't just be limited to research publications, but that ultimately our goal is to be able to tell stories that are legible, coherent, crisp, and work at every level.
And I would just add, I think there's something to be said about events like this, translating our work for a public that is really interested in having these discussions. And I'm personally finding it very generative, and I hope that we can continue to have these types of engagements because I think that they go a long way to helping give us all language with which to talk about these really important topics.
I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Billy and Alicia, our interpreters, to Brian for filling in, to the Schomburg Center, and mostly to our audience all across the diaspora for joining us for this really important conversation tonight. Please come back. So as always, Conversations is the first Thursday of the month at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. And we are going to be talking about racism and the Black struggle after the Civil Rights Movement. So we're really going to jump to the recent past from the slightly farther past. So please join us May 5th. We'll be joined by Carol Anderson, Elizabeth Hinton, Emily Hobson, and Daniel Luck. So it should be a great conversation. You can follow us at Schomburg CBFS. And again, all our programs are at blackfreedomstudies.org. So if you've missed ones or you want to rewatch them, you can find them there. Thank you so much. Be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you in May.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.